Okay. Um, Colette, I will hand it over to you. And I'm going to move this up here. Okay.
So I'm just gonna make it so it's just me and not like seeing.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do, but I think that, okay, I think if I click pin, there we go.
There we go.
Perfect. Okay. Now we're good.
You're in business. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for helping me with all the tech issues. My laptop decided to not turn on, and so we're just adjusting as we go. So thanks for having me. My name is Colette Dalton, use pronouns she, her, and like I said, I am a licensed clinical social worker and certified sex therapist. And I am very passionate about queer joy. And I think a lot of people are like, why queer joy? Why talk about queer joy? There's so much queer pain. And I'm like, that's why I'm so passionate about queer joy. I found when I gave a version of this presentation to some fellow therapists. And as I was prepping for that, I found this quote that really spoke to me about why I feel queer joy is so important. When the world feels dark and you fight with light. It's okay to watch a comedy and laugh. It's okay to go to a concert and dance. It's okay to go to a wedding and celebrate. It's okay to go on a date and dream. You can hold two things at once, mourning with those who mourn while not letting the darkness take you out as well. When you rise from your knees praying for those in the darkness, throw light like confetti. And that just really spoke to me. And I'm glad I didn't go through the effort of finding this video because we're having issues with video. But I also remember seeing a queer creator talk about how during the AIDS crisis, people said we go to funerals in the morning of our friends, we protest in the afternoon, and then we dance all night. And I think we need all three. And I'd say with my history and background, I am very much drawn to the queer joy part of it, the dancing all night, even though it's really hard sometimes. I know coming from different backgrounds, and I'll share more of my queer joy story later on in the presentation. I can get really stuck in the darkness sometimes. There's a lot of barriers to feeling joy. And so that's one reason I'm so passionate about being able to tap into it and help others recognize the importance of it. Another quote I really love, Heart and House, who's actually right above Carlucci's actually. So that was a fun little thing, seeing that we have bakeries, pastries from that bakery. Heart and House is a phenomenal experiential trauma therapy practice in downtown Salt Lake. And I was talking to Amy, who owns it, and we had a conversation about this, and then she posted it on Instagram. Many people know the body keeps the score. And I think it's really interesting to have the idea of, well, the body keeps the score of the good stuff as well. And the reason she did this quote in particular is she does a lot of psychodrama, and the father of psychodrama, Jail Moreno. And he had a quote that says, the body remembers what the mind forgets. And so often in therapy work, our minds has protected us from the trauma, but our body remembers the good stuff as well. So the body remembers what the mind forgets. The body remembers the good stuff too. And as I was having this conversation with her, I was actually preparing to give another presentation about joy, and I was not feeling it. Honestly, that was kind of like today too. Today was a rough day in some ways. And so as we were talking, she led me through this exercise that actually helped me remember and tap back into that joy. And suddenly I was feeling better. I was able to tap into the joy and feel it in the present, not just remember what happened in the past, because your body does remember good stuff too. So when we talk about joy in general, like what even is it? If you've been to any therapy at all, maybe you've seen a feelings wheel. You can go to feelingswheel.com if you ever need a quick reference. I know for me, I didn't have a lot of language for emotions growing up. Maybe that's partly why I became a therapist. And this can be really helpful as people are learning, like, what are my emotions? You know, there are more than just the inside out few emotions. Like, you know, if you've watched that movie, Fabulous, you can tell they consulted therapists on it. There's also this great chart. Brene Brown wrote a book called Atlas of the Heart, where she classified different emotions and talked about what each emotion is. And she classified joy as a place we go when life is good. So I appreciate different brains like different things. Some people maybe like the feelings wheel. Some people maybe like the categorization of like where you go when things are uncertain. because maybe you can tell the circumstances around, but not what you're feeling. I know for me, again, I can be kind of disconnected from my emotions sometimes. Um, so, speaking specifically about joy, how do you define it? And there's lots of different definitions out there. From Brene Brown's research, she says it's an intense feeling of deep spiritual connection, pleasure, and appreciation. And she talks about how joy is more internal, while happiness is more external and circumstantial. So joy just feels a little deeper and not necessarily as tied to circumstances as we might think. Another researcher, Matthew Hahn Johnson, said that people who are experiencing joy actually find it difficult to articulate like what joy is or means. It's and that's one reason this, I think, presentation and talking about joy is so interesting, because how do you define it? If I were to say, what does joy mean to you? I see a lot of people just kind of freeze and like, I know it when I feel it, but I don't know like what that might mean or look like necessarily. There's also research about joy, about how there's a relationship between joy and gratitude. And someone said it was an intriguing upward spiral, that just as you are more grateful, you have more joy, and it keeps going upward. So right now, I just would invite you to take a minute and check in, if we were to go back to the feelings wheel, just where you're at. No right or wrong, but as a therapist, I feel I would be remiss in my duties if we didn't have a little check-in about emotions. And it's okay if you can't identify exactly what you're feeling. Again, maybe you can identify one of the bigger mid emotions. Okay, I'm in the happy category, or I'm a little in the sad category. And then there are other words that can be associated with that. Maybe you notice a sensation in your body. And maybe with that sensation, maybe you can imagine a color that's associated with it. But just taking a moment to check in, and we'll also check in at the end and see just maybe if things have shifted, and it's fine if not. But just notice where you're at now. So there are a lot of barriers to accessing joy, and especially accessing queer joy. I don't want to go into why it's hard, because I think as queer individuals and people who love queer individuals, it's pretty intuitive what some of the barriers are. There are both systemic and individual barriers. Systemic barriers such as anti-queer legislation. Every legislative session, I'm just bracing myself for what's happening now. What's the next thing that's going to pass? That takes a toll. And Dr. Lisa Diamond, even who's at the U, did some really interesting research surveying queer individuals and their family members before and after the legislative session to see how they were doing. And interestingly, what she found in that research was the family members of queer individuals were actually doing worse than the queer individuals, which I thought was fascinating, but also makes sense, because I think a lot of times as queer individuals, we've kind of almost, I'll speak for myself, I won't say this is true for everyone, but almost like oh, of course, like, yeah, that's what's happening. Like almost just an acceptance of, yeah, didn't expect it to be great. Whereas I think sometimes people who aren't queer themselves see the impact and maybe aren't realizing. So that can be a huge barrier when you are not able to use the bathroom that it aligns with who you are. That is a huge barrier when your teacher has to take down the rainbow flag in the classroom. So definite barriers that way. Barriers to receiving healthcare. There's a lot of changes going on at the governmental level. And while individual practitioners are obviously doing what they can to take care of their clients and patients, that can be difficult. Discrimination, big systemic barrier. And there's religious barriers. I'll be telling a little bit more of my queer joy story and just joy journey, or queer journey. And that was a big part of me being able to feel any sort of positive emotion around my queerness. And then, of course, there's individual barriers, which might stem from some systemic barriers as well. Having family disconnection, disownment, or rejection, or fear of that happening, even if it's not actually happening. Different mental health issues. I could pull out all sorts of stats from like the Trevor Project and things about how people are more likely to experience suicidal ideation and attempts. um, and have depression, anxiety, and different things when there is discrimination, when they're dealing with these things. And I always like to point out, like, it's not that something's wrong with being queer. I hope we all know that. It's a lot of times the barriers people are up against and that they face because they are queer that lead to. It's not that being queer makes you depressed. It might open you up to additional depression when you have these additional barriers, though. Um, and then internalized homophobia, definitely something that can be part of both, I think, systemic and individual. Um, Intersectional issues, as well as dissociation. I recently gave a presentation about how dissociation is such a barrier for a lot of queer people without even realizing it. I still realize how I'm doing some of my own healing around being dissociated and not even realizing it as a protective factor. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So dissociation is just kind of a disconnection from yourself in some sort of way or another. Dissociation can be, just not being aware of your emotions or feelings or what's going on. I'm not saying people necessarily have full, like, oh, I don't even remember that happening. There is a diagnosis where people kind of become someone else and dissociate that much. But I think dissociation can be as simple as like, oh, I just want to not pay attention to anything and watch TV. I want to Sometimes dissociation is what leads people to maybe start drinking too much or using drugs. But I know for me, dissociation is just has been that disconnection that has served me really well in a lot of circumstances because it was too painful to feel certain things. If I could just numb and kind of disconnect from the rough feelings, then I would be okay. The problem with dissociation, though, and disconnecting from hard emotions you might be feeling is then you're also disconnected from any other emotion because you can't just say, hey, I'm not going to just not feel depression or sadness or anger, frustration. That also means, okay, then I'm not going to be feeling joy. I'm not going to be feeling happiness and contentment and peace because you're disconnected from any sort of emotion. You can't just numb. I just want to numb these ones and disconnect from those. Unfortunately, we have to feel it all. Did that help? And I'm happy to answer questions. I know save them for the end, but if there are things like that to clarify, I'm happy to. Um, Another barrier. So this was a video I'll just summarize. If you want to look it up, it was Brene Brown and talking with Oprah Winfrey on Super Soul Sunday. And she talks about the concept of foreboding joy. And she was talking to Oprah initially and was like, what do you think is the hardest emotion to feel? And they start talking, it's actually joy. Because have you ever had, and she gives an example of have as a parent going into their sleeping kids' rooms and just loving them so much and then having to almost pull away because the intensity of that feeling was too much. And what if I lose it? What if something happens to them? I can't handle that. And she gives another example of a man who talked to her that his wife had passed away in a terrible car accident. And he said, looking back, I had not fully allowed myself the joy of being with her because I was so scared of losing her. And did that lessen the pain when I did? No. But joy is a scary emotion. And so I found this uh, picture and loved the quote from it that says, I can think of one of the bravest things a human can do is to let the light and joy back in, even though it might go again. As humans, we like feeling positive emotions. And it's, for me, scary. What if this goes away? Can I trust that I'll be okay if it goes away? Maybe it's better to stay dissociated in them. Maybe it's better, like maybe I'm actually more comfortable in the sadness. I'm used to it here. But that little spark of joy, what if there is something maybe that could be worth living for? Even if it might not be there forever, knowing that emotions come and go, and that's okay, and that's hard. So, why queer joy? These are some things I came up with why queer joy is so important to me and why I've seen it be very helpful with clients and people I've talked to, what we've seen historically. Though I'm not a big historian, but it can give us the strength and resilience to keep going. Again, going back to that quote from the beginning of during the AIDS crisis, we buried our friends in the morning, protested in the afternoon, and danced all night. I really truly think the dancing all night is what gave them the strength to keep showing up to funerals and supporting people and to keep going to protests, even when it didn't feel like anything was happening. I think those take a level of strength that we need to be able to replenish. And one way I found I've been able to do that is by allowing myself to feel queer joy. And for me, queer joy, I'll be talking more about my story, but anytime when I'm able to feel affirmed in my queerness, um, is a feeling of queer joy for me. Leaning into joy, again, can give us that fuller emotional expression. If we're not allowing ourselves to feel joy, we're not going to be able to feel many emotions very deeply. It's more surface level. I truly think that if we don't allow ourselves to even feel more sadness, it can be harder to feel a greater amount of joy. We need both, even though that's really, really hard as humans. And I would love to just be feeling joy and happiness and peace and contentment all the time, right? Sign me up for that life. But we need both. We need to have that full expression of emotions that I think sometimes we limit ourselves. That can be going back to barriers, both an individual and systemic thing. Maybe growing up in a family where only certain emotions were allowed. Um, Queer joy also helps us tap into all parts of our identity. I know for a long time, part of my journey, I cut that part of me off. And so being able to accept parts of myself that I hadn't before was very healing. And it pushes us to continue to liberate ourselves. And others can't take away your emotions and experiences from you. This is yours. It's been so interesting as I'm reevaluating and trying to figure out my relationship with social media. It's really, really hard when people can be so harsh and invalidating on different identities. Um, and this might be a silly example, but I remember I was at a retreat I was hosting about a year ago in St. George, and I was just wearing my rainbow sunglasses, as I do. And a couple of teenage kids like floated by and made a really kind of derogatory remark about me wearing rainbow sunglasses. And I was really sad for a moment that where did they learn this hate from me wearing rainbow sunglasses? They didn't know I was queer. They probably assumed it. But in that moment, I was still able to be okay because I know and have accepted this part of myself, and no one can take that away from me. They were able to impact my well being in that moment for a minute. And then I was able to kind of recenter and say, that's theirs to work through, and I hope they do. And I'm glad it was to me and not someone who's maybe more vulnerable. So, um, yeah, those are some ideas I come up with. I'm sure there's more reasons why queer joy is so important and helpful. But I want to talk a little bit about my story, about and why it's important to me. If you will allow a little personal history into this. So I grew up in California, very Mormon, very religious. I had a boyfriend my last few months of high school. Um, I went to BYU for both my degrees. I was an EFY counselor after I graduated with my MSW. I was so excited to go through the temple, receive my endowment, and I received it on my 16th anniversary to the day of me getting baptized. So then I did that little collage of look at me at age 8, look at me at age 24, because my state president wouldn't let me go to the temple until I turned 24. Um, and it really was working for me. And then I fell in love with my roommate. That kind of turned my world upside down. Um, and it was really, really disorienting. At the time, I was working for the church. I was working for Deseret Industries up in the Boise area. And I was so confused how this relationship could feel so good and I could feel so much happiness and peace. But I was getting all these messages from people around me, mainly church messaging, that it wasn't okay and that I was wrong. got some light conversion therapy looking back. I was actually recently looking back through a journal and I was like, oh my gosh, my therapist said that. Like, should I report him? Like that's damaging. It's not like I received electrical shock treatment or anything like that, but just I sometimes wonder, like, what would it have been like if he had just said, huh, that's really interesting. How are you feeling about this? Instead of just buying into me saying, oh, this is wrong, this is bad, I shouldn't be feeling this. What if he had asked, like, are you queer? Because I had never asked myself that question. I was in love with this one woman, and I thought that was wrong and a fluke and a sin. Um, so this picture at Desert Industries was my last day working there, and then I came down, got a job at Ensign College, and um, settling in. And then my ex-girlfriend, who I was still friends with, as stereotypical gay cliche, started dating another woman, and I was like, wait a minute. I thought we were straight, except for each other, and we just were both sinning, and it was a fluke. If you're dating someone that's not a guy, what does that mean about me? And that's when I started actually looking at my sexuality 3 years after I'd been in a relationship with this woman. Um, and I realized I was queer. And that was devastating for me. It was hard enough working for the church and being like, oh, I'm dating a woman and I shouldn't, and just let me cut that part off. And again, I cut it off pretty hardcore to not even realize I was gay. Like people laugh at that, but that's how deep the internalized homophobia went for me. That's how deep the compulsory heterosexuality went for me. And as I started to meet other queer people, which some of these pictures up here, I started to realize, wait, it's possible to not hate yourself for being queer. That was radical for me. As I met people from different queer organizations I was going to, making friends, to actually meet someone who didn't hate themselves was radical because I hated that I was gay. And it really, for a long time, was coming down to like, I wish I wanted to cut off the Mormon part of me or the queer part of me. And since I didn't feel like I could cut off either, I just wanted to die. The depression was really, really rough. But when I started meeting queer people who you can see in these gatherings, like they're happy. They're happy with themselves. They were living life. I was like, maybe that could be possible. And it took some time. I had a lot of conversations with my therapist, a lot of journaling, a lot of self-reflection. And I know a lot of people can integrate different parts of their identity. And for me, I was able to integrate these two seemingly very different parts of me by having to taking a step away from the Mormon church. And by doing that, I was able to become very out, proud, loud. I started a podcast I co-hosted with my friend called Called to Queer, where we shared we noticed that there was a lack of podcasts that were hosted by queer non-cis men in the LDS space. There were some great ones hosted by allies, some one by gay men, but we wanted to share more stories of queer women and non-binary and genderqueer people. And so I'm really proud of that. We haven't done anything with it in several years with different things we've had going on, but there's like 48 great episodes if you want to go listen to that. We share our stories and listen to our guests share their stories. I started a private practice called Queerful Counseling, very focused on being welcoming and open to the queer community. I started wearing rainbows. You can see those infamous rainbow sunglasses on the top of my head in one of those. I've hosted some virtual summits that I really feel so passionate about helping people tap into that queer joy. And I'm able to be out. Does that mean that I never feel depressed? No. Like, I have depression. Like, my brain is wired a little differently. That's okay. But even today, it's been interesting as I've had a kind of rough day with some personal stuff going on, how I've been able to still tap into the emotion of joy and community and coming to this and be able to make that shift to a better state of mind. So what I would invite you to do now, oh, in a minute. Actually, we're going to come back. Um, yes.
Just the edges. Oh, okay. Getting dark.
I know the overcast.
I'll go over there and I'll open those blinds up.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry to
No, you're good. So I just want to invite you to take a moment, that was me reflecting on a little bit of my queer joy journey of going from someone who didn't even realize they were queer to then hating myself for being queer to now accepting that as part of me and integrating it. That's not, I am still obviously queer. And it's not necessarily something I lead with all the time anymore because it's a little more integrated. It's been a journey. And so I would just invite you right now to just notice, again, checking in with how you're feeling. And notice if there's any spot in your body that you maybe feel a little bit of joy. Because I know for me, even just gathering and being able to talk about queerness is queer joy for me. On this slide, I was able to gather some examples from friends of what an example of a recent queer joy for them was. But for me, queer joy is community. And that's one thing I'm really passionate about. And I'm so grateful to be able to talk about this concept in community. For me, wearing rainbow is queer joy. I have a lot of rainbow tees in my closet. I love making new queer friends. I recently went on a blind date with a woman for the first time in a few years, and that was queer joy. And it was really queer joy when I found out I was her first date with a woman. And I was like, wait a minute. I've always been the experienced one, the inexperienced one. Like, this is interesting for me. But you can see what others said, that buying all the flannel at Costco gave them queer joy. When a new friend told me that they could tell I wasn't straight, that was affirming to them. For someone else who wasn't even queer, they were able to experience queer joy when her son remembered what non-binary meant. I think sometimes people are like, well, I'm not queer. Can I experience queer joy? I'm like, if you want, yeah, for sure. Like, I experience queer joy when I see a queer couple holding hands. I experience queer joy when I see a queer representation in media. I remember reading a book recently, and suddenly, not in the main characters, it was a romance book, but then there was a sub couple that was queer, and I was like, I didn't even expect this. This made my day. And I'd love to hear from you, just open up a little bit, like what are some examples you might have of queer joy? If you have any, and if not, that's okay. Yeah.
Moms are gay.
Your moms are gay. I love that for you. Everyday queer joy. That's amazing. Yeah. Yes.
Because they're living their authentic lives.
Yeah.
It feels like most times, especially like pride.
Yes.
Everybody's so.
Yes. Just how, yeah. So just for people online, how happy people are, how queer people are, especially when you can see that on display at Pride. I love going to all the Pride events for that reason. Yeah.
My queer joy today is Connell's heart being okay.
Yes. Connell's heart being okay.
Yeah. Just like good medical news and like seeing, especially like having queer elders who we can learn from.
For sure.
Is actually really important, I think, as well. Like learning from you and doing things like this, like documenting the history.
Yes.
Because it's relatively new and relatively radical to have something like this.
Yes. Documenting the history, having this queer elders for sure. Whenever I'm able, someone referred to me as a queer elder, and I'm like, please don't. I'm not there yet. But I think it can be hard to connect sometimes when there's a reason we don't have some queer elders, right? There's some very systemic historical injustices that happened that made it so people died and they were closeted. And so it's very interesting, even on our podcast, when we talk to someone who was a little older and hearing their experiences versus like what me and my co-host experience was. Yeah.
learning about my queer ancestors.
Yeah, learning about
As
queer
a historian,
ancestors.
finding their lives, finding their joys, their problems, their sorrows, their hopes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Mildred brings me so much joy.
I want to read all the stuff about her now. Like that was fascinating to hear that intro. I hadn't I knew the name because of this organization, but I didn't know anything about. That's fascinating. So thank you for sharing that.
I was in the park yesterday walking my dog, as I do every day, and there were these two guys in front of me, and they were just holding hands and smiling and talking and kissing and laughing.
Yes.
And I was right behind him, and I just felt so happy.
Yes.
I just felt so happy for him.
I love that. That's one of my favorite things too, is just seeing queer couples in public. Sometimes I want to be like, me too, me too, me too. Like, it's like, how can I show them I'm gay? Because I present a little too femme. Like, we're the same. But yeah, seeing that happiness in public, I think is so radical. Thank you. So I also invite you to now check in after hearing each other's queer joys. How are you feeling? I know for me, even just hearing other people talk about their queer joys increases mine. Like I feel so much more pumped up right now than I was before because I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. I'd also invite you, there's lots of different ways to tap into it. Pause, I'm gonna go back. Benefits of queer joy. I think we just experienced a benefit of queer joy. Being able to shift your state, potentially. Will it work every time? No. There's times that sometimes you just don't. I was talking to a friend today and I was just like, I almost like don't want, like I know what would make me feel better, but I don't want to because I kind of just want to mope. You've ever had those days? But it can help you change mental states and emotional states sometimes, right? It can literally help rewire the brain as our brain seeks out what we're looking for. And so if we're looking for more joy, we can find more of it. Emily Lays is a queer hypnotherapy practitioner that I follow on Instagram. And I love this thing they said, that take in more of the good by deliberately and enjoying and savoring when things go your way. The more we enjoy the teeny tiny good experiences that happen, the more we're communicating to our brains that we want to notice them in the future. I kind of hate the cliche of making a gratitude list, but there's a reason it works and people say to do it. You're continuing to seek out those things. And I think the idea of having like a queer joy journal of like, today I saw a really cute queer couple. Today I was able to wear something that really affirmed my identity. Today, I was able to tell someone what non-binary meant. Today, your brain starts looking for more of the positive and can help rewire those pathways. Again, I've talked about how queer joy community for me, so powerful and important. And I think a lot of times we gather together as queer individuals to mourn. How powerful is it to gather together and participate in joy and affirming each other as well, though? And queer joy is a huge part of that for me. With community, connection, and like I said, resilience. I really don't think our queer elders made it through hard times historically if they didn't also lean into the joy. We need all of it. I also love this quote I found. I'm, again, reevaluating my relationship with social media, but there's some good stuff on there. And someone said, an author I love just tweeted about how big and small joy are the same and how she was just as content the other night eating chocolate and cuddling her dog as she was on her big trip to New York. And honestly, I think that's it. This morning I was listening to an audiobook while baking shortbread in my joggers, and I realized I really didn't care what big things happened in my future as long as I'd keep baking and reading at the weekend. And maybe that is the kind of bar we have to set to guard ourselves against disappointment. Just appreciate and cherish the mundane stuff and see everything else as a bonus. Because I know I seek after those like really high, big joy moments. Oh my gosh, I just went on this amazing queer date. Oh my gosh, I just won this award. Right? We look for those highs a lot in our life. What if we also look for those small moments of joy and almost like micro moments of resilience, right? We don't need something big all the time. For me, sometimes it is oh, I just had a friend who checked in with how I was doing after they had seen a hard queer news article, or someone sent me an awesome, good queer news article. Something good actually happened for once. Um, what if we leaned into those moments and not just waited for the next big one and maybe even created those? So, ways to tap into queer joy. We had that experience of just sharing queer joy. One thing I loved that Kate and I did on our podcast is we started every podcast discussing what our queer joy was for the week. And that was such a fun way for us to start off, and we invited our guests to do the same. And I think that really kicked off a good way of, one, I had to pay attention to how my week was going, so I had something to share. So again, rewiring my brain a little bit that way. But also, it set a really interesting tone that we were talking about some painful stories sometimes. But we also were able to still acknowledge that joy exists, even in the small things. So, ways to tap into that, again, sharing, talking about it. One thing I like to do is actually write down when I've had a good joy moment and then have it easily accessible that I can tap back into. For a while, I was even saving like a highlight on my Instagram whenever I shared a queer joy moment, so then I could go back to the highlight when I needed a little boost. You can also experientially thinking as a therapist, like what might I have a client do? I've had clients depict in some way a very joyful moment for them. Again, even if it was a quiet joy, like can you depict it somehow? We have stuff to make a collage that they can then have, or paints or markers or whatever, making it more concrete that way. I've also, talking to Amy, going back to the quote from the beginning about your body remembers the good stuff too, she did a thing with me called a spectrogram, where she just had me listen to my body and said, okay, standing over there is like you're not feeling any joy at all. Over here, you're feeling 100% joy. Just listen to your body and where are you at? So this is something I do sometimes so I can check in with where am I at with different things. And so I was doing it, and I was probably like at a 3 on the scale, just not super feeling it as I was trying to prepare for a presentation talking about joy. And she said, okay, now I want you to imagine over there is a splash pad of queer joy. Go splash in it for a little bit. And I kind of looked at her and I was like, what? But okay, because I trust you. And so I went over and like pretended I was in a rainbow splash pad for a little bit. And then she's like, okay, now rate yourself. And suddenly, I had moved several places up the scale. Because again, our body remembers what the mind forgets, and it remembers the good stuff too. And so in that experience, that really just took a couple of moments, I was able to tap back into that joy in a really powerful way that maybe sounds silly if you weren't experiencing it. But I was able to tap back into where my body was and then rate where I was. So with that, are there other things that you've been able to do to tap into queer joy when you need it? I'd love to hear it.
Small things.
Yeah.
I live in Ogden, but I have to drive it.
Uh-huh.
So but when I wake up, I like to give myself a little bit of time to just unwind.
Yeah.
Sleeping. And I got my morning coffee, and I hang out with my pets.
Mm-hmm.
I love talking about chickens. I love those things bring me joy, and they're small, but it's something that I can do every time with coffee.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. Those micro moments of joy that I think sometimes we forget count, right? Just leaning into I don't want to say mundane because there's almost like a negative connotation with that, but like just the daily living and how we can tap into that. So thank you so much for that example. You don't need something huge. It can be those smaller, simpler moments of joy as well. Thank you.
I think we all have smaller versions of our joy that we enjoy.
Yeah.
I do the same thing. I get up in the morning and have my coffee, and I sit on my bed with my dog, and look at a little television, a little Hulu or whatever, little YouTube videos, and I enjoy. You may think it's stupid, but I enjoy talking to my dog, you know, and I talk to my dog in a different, weird sort of way. How you doing, buddy? Hi, and they start talking to him like that. How you doing, buddy? Oh, I'm doing fine, thank you. And they said, is that how he talks? It's like, yes, that's how he talks. Well, you know, that's my joy.
I love that.
And my joy is seeing my grandkids talk like that to my dog.
Yeah.
That's my joy.
Yes.
That's my little joy.
I love that. I love being just, those are such powerful examples of those moments we can lean into. And I think, obviously, talking about queer joy is something I'm passionate about, but I really think it's important for us to just recognize in general, like even aside from a queer joy moment, like, can you, I really think tapping into moments of joy in general can give us that resilience. Because how easy is it to be like, oh my gosh, what did the legislative do now? What executive order was just signed? What was just removed from that historical website, right? In this fun historical moment we're living in. Tapping into the joy, I'm not saying to bypass the pain and the mourning and the sadness and the grief and whatever emotions come up with that. But I think allowing ourselves to also experience joy in the simple and big moments allows us the resilience to keep going through the hard things that we're experiencing now and might experience in the future. Because I know for me, when I wasn't experiencing joy, my depression had a strong hold on me. And I didn't want to be here anymore. And now, as I'm able to experience some of those moments a little more often, it's like, oh, okay, this still's really hard. And like, I can keep going because I danced all night. I can now go to the protests and the funerals, right? So, with that, do you want to run the questions or? Okay, any questions? Any thoughts? I'd love to hear. Yeah.
I like what you said about gratitude.
Yeah.
And what it's such an important element of joy.
Yeah, gratitude and joy are really tied together. Thank you for bringing that up. I've thought about creating like a joy journal, a queer joy journal, and maybe I'll do that one day because they're so tied. And it's so easy for me, I'll speak for me, I won't speak for everyone. It's easy for me to forget those moments in the hard times too.
I put little thank you cards all around.
Oh, I love that. Thank you cards all around the house. That's awesome. Yeah.
I just wanted to say this was really uplifting for me because, like, being historians, it's just such a dark time right now for historians, and doing queer history, there is a lot of darkness. So to have this conversation, I think is really powerful. And I wanted to thank you for sharing your story about, I think that what you went through of growing up in Mormonism and having this kind of, you know, the tower falling over moment would be very relatable to a lot of people involved with Mildred Berryman or watching on YouTube. And I was wondering if you could share like more of like maybe just even a nugget of wisdom around joy as it relates to spirituality and faith for people who maybe that is not an area that they even touch anymore because of their sexuality or because of faith transition. Because, you know, especially for the queer community, religion and faith and spirituality, it's dangerous territory. And it's hard to get into that. But could you just share more about that element of joy?
Sure. So the element of joy with spirituality, I'll talk from my experience. For me, there was a lot of reclaiming that had to be done because, as you referenced the tower moment in tarot, we can talk more later.
Yeah.
Can I swear?
You can swear.
Holy shit. Like, like that was, I don't even have words for how world crumbling that was. And I remember I was talking to my therapist. I'm like, I feel like I'm rebuilding a house and having to look brick by brick. Do I want to keep this? Do I want to keep this? Do I want to keep this? And it was exhausting. And so for me, the reclaiming, I had to step away for from organized religion. That's not everyone's path. And sometimes I hear feedback from people of like, oh, you're telling people they have to step away from religion. So I'm glad you brought that. No, you don't. Like, you've got to find what works for you. My story is I had to step away. But there were different ways I still realized spirituality was important to me. So for a while, I was still gathering with queer friends and talking scriptures and doing like what we wish Sunday school could be at church. We called it queer gay Sunday school. Like, it wasn't actually called that, but that's what it was. And then for me, it's starting to explore some more mystical practices. Part of me getting into tarot and oracle cards was actually me starting to listen to myself again. I joined a tarot group, and it was the first time I wasn't having someone else tell me how to feel or tell me what was going on or what I should do, because I would draw a card and I'd reflect on it and didn't necessarily have someone else interpret it for me. That was radical, and that became a spiritual practice in a way. And I'm definitely part of the queer to woo-woo pipeline that some people get into. I now gather with some friends monthly for the full moon, and we have a little burning ceremony and just talk and catch up and pull cards. But I think it's so important to, again, find what works for you. And that, I think, is just the power of queer joy and life in general. And what you referenced was like the happiness of being themselves. So, like, what works for you? What works for you spirituality wise? And I think for me, it was really difficult growing up in a high demand religion like Mormonism, because it worked great for me until it didn't. I was so good at following rules. So good. Like, give me a checklist and I will do it. You know, got my personal progress by age 13. I read all the standard works by age 14. I graduated early morning seminary. Like, I can do it when you give me a checklist. And when I realized the checklist wasn't working for me anymore, it was so disorienting, because then I had to actually listen to myself. And I was so used to following what other people told me. But I really think spirituality and the queer joy in that, side note, I really think I have this other stump speech about how everyone would benefit from queering their life. Because to me, queerness is about doing what works for you and figuring out what works for you in all the different areas. And I think that's how I queered spirituality for me, but everyone's journey is different. But is that an okay? Thanks. We'll have to exchange numbers. You can come over and see my insane tarot and oracle deck collection. That'd be so fun. I joke that I have like a witchy corner in my basement. So yeah.
Who does it these days?
It's so fun.
Oh, it looks like there's a comment on the chat, but I think if you click it, you'll be able to pull up the chat.
Ooh, nope, not the share button.
Yeah.
Can you help me? Why am I?
Yes, I'll come.
Oh, there we go. Oh, it's also really nuanced to navigate a family who is split religiously. Maintaining those relationships can become harder, and determining where lines have to be drawn can be quite the process, for sure. Definitely. Sorry, how do I exit out of this one? I think that just like this. Hello. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's been really difficult even for me, and I won't get into a ton of details, but my family is still very Mormon. And that can be difficult. And the way my family has dealt with it is we tend to just not talk about it. So that's not one of my queer joys. But it can be really hard. And I think that's, again, one idea, my other stump speech about how everyone could benefit from queering their life, figuring out what works for you. And that's really hard when maybe it's not what works for your family or what your family wants to have work for you. And just having to trust your own inner knowing. And that's quite the journey. And I think it's one that queer people end up going through pretty, it's like almost expected you have to go through it as a queer person, growing, especially I think in Utah and with coming from a high demand religion. So other thoughts, questions? Yeah. Uh-huh. That's a good point.
The disruption is that it allows for change, growth,
Mm-hmm.
and it allows for like people never would have imagined to create, imagine to even exist.
Absolutely.
And that's what people see is that just by virtue of being yourself, being somebody else, be themselves, and bring about changing the background.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you. I'm trying to think how to sum it up, but that was just so good. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I was gonna build off what Megan said. Because when you talked about seeing that couple in the park, I mean, it just shows where I'm at and how I can actually do some of this. I just think, and then there are some people who would see that gay couple and get angry and disgusted, and they're the people who can't handle the rule breaking, and that things can be different, that things can be outside of the to-do list. And it's just so important to make even those tiny decisions like you're looking at to actively choose joy.
Yeah.
Instead of getting disgusted and frustrated at that couple, so many other people could, how great is it that they found each other?
Mm-hmm.
Move on.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is, part of my queer joy is the choosing the joy in those moments, even knowing that if I were to look around, there could be some scowls seeing a queer couple. I've noticed most people aren't rude face to face as much. It's more the online stuff. Most people, I feel like especially in Mormonism, it's more we'll ignore and pretend it's not a thing. Maybe that's not everyone's experience. That has been mine. But there may still be queer pain within that. And I'm choosing to recognize the queer joy in seeing that queer couple, even if someone else can't. But thank you for your comment. Yeah.
I'm just so glad that our community is at a place now where we can really start focusing on joy.
Yeah.
Having lived through, out during the AIDS epidemic, 1985, there was, we went from queer terror to queer anger. And there was a lot of healing.
Yeah.
Now we're at a space where, queer joy. This is pretty recent. It's been, 5, 6, 7 years that we finally started using that term.
Yeah.
Queer joy. This is really recent. Yes, we're there.
And I think we still need the queer anger. I think we need all the emotions to keep moving forward. But thank you for your perspective on that. Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely it is. Form of resistance.
What you couldn't do before.
Yeah.
Or what you didn't want to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know how important that's been for me. And what I didn't get into is the dating history that happened after that first girlfriend. And the queer joy that happened as I did enough of my own healing that I could actually be public with it, because it was a form of resistance of almost when I finally could be public, when I was no longer working for the church and dated someone, it did feel very much like resistance of like, you're going to be mad at me for being happy? What? It's so powerful. I think that joy, resistance and resilience, I love it. If there's any other comments or questions? Okay. All right. You have any last things to say?
I can shut it down, but just
Okay.
thank you again so much for speaking. And a little bit of housekeeping. Do you want to talk about books for sale, Beth?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you should definitely mention the Book of Queer Moment Joy, if nothing else.